Again, my name is Matt Reichert, the Director of the Center for Learning at OCP. I am joined by two colleagues in ministry, Scott Crandal and Zack Stachowski. I'm going to ask both of you to introduce yourselves in a minute. But again, welcome to all of you who are here, this conversation on introducing new music to your congregation. Just a real quick word before our panelists introduce themselves. There is, or I should say, will be a handout for this session, but we're going to create it together. So I'll say more about that in a second, but those of you who have been a part of our past webinar conversations know this is usually the time you get the link to the resource packet, and it's going to be coming after this because we're going to assemble our own list of suggestions and best practices as part of today's conversation. Before we begin to do that, just because I see you in this order on my screen, Scott, would you introduce yourself to all of us, what we ought to know about you before we kick off this conversation?
Sounds good. Well, I've been a director of music at the St. John's Episcopal Church here in Portland, Oregon for 25 years. And we do a lot of a wide variety of music, and both contemporary. Also, we have hymnal 1982 in our pews. We use a lot of that, but we use a lot of OCP music, GIA, World Library, a variety. And also I work at OCP in music development to help bring new music to fruition. So yeah, and I'm active in the area as a singer, and I sub at various Catholic churches on Saturdays, playing at Mass.
And if you want to hear Scott do all kinds of great, crazy things with his voice, especially with different vocalises and warm-ups, you can check out that other webinar on working with aging voices.
We had fun.
If nothing else, it's great just to listen to another person that maybe you've not met before do a bunch of vocalises on Zoom. So, so thanks for coming back, Scott, and for being a good sport. And Zack, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and what you do and what we ought to know about you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zack Stachowski. I'm the Director of Music and Liturgy at Guardian Angels Catholic Church in Oakdale, Minnesota. I'm a composer with GIA Publications, author with 23rd Publications, and co-director of the One Call Institute.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for being here. Again, big topic, a lot of stuff we can talk about, a lot of rabbit holes to go down, right? So again, today we're talking about how do you introduce new music to your congregation? What are the best practices? So maybe just to begin and just to warm up, knowing that both you, Scott, and you, Zack, are in active ministry in singing congregations. Maybe I'll start with you, Zack, in reverse order. Like what are the new things you're planning to introduce? What are some of the new things you have introduced? Kind of doing a few month look back, few month look ahead. Where are you at yourself in your ministry in terms of introducing new music?
Well, currently there have been a couple new communion songs that we've introduced here, and we are about 6 weeks into introducing a brand new Mass setting to this community.
Yeah, so you're sort of mid stride here on some of this. And what about you, Scott? Are you at a point now where you're starting to introduce some new things, or have been introducing some new things?
Yeah, we have some failures and some successes recently, but yeah, I find that we've been, like Zack mentioned, communion is a good time to introduce new things, because a lot of times those refrains can be shorter and easier to learn, and we haven't introduced a new Mass setting in a while, but that's coming up.
Yeah.
So anyway, we have in the past, and there's interesting stories about that. And
yeah. Well, I mean, and so you guys are again right in the thick of what maybe many of you joining us live, or those of you who are watching this recording, are into, in the process of thinking about introducing, evaluating music. So Zack, I'm going to start with you then, as you mentioned introducing these communion songs, for example. To begin with, because again, there are a lot of different ways that we can go with the conversation. Let's maybe deconstruct the way that you've introduced some of these newer pieces, knowing that they're specifically communion pieces. And by way of disclaimer, again, those of you joining, as we're talking about introducing new music, reminder, we're talking specifically about introducing new music for your congregation to learn and sing. So we're not talking about learning that new choral anthem or something that maybe is going to be a solo or instrumental piece, etc., but specifically a way to get a piece in front of your congregation so they're comfortable to sing it. So would you mind, Zach, just sharing sort of your process, maybe what went well, what didn't go well as you were introducing these new communion pieces?
Well, I think probably the first place to start is to develop a really good knowledge of what is known by your congregation and what is possibly new. And especially for someone, I've been at this parish, Guardian Angels, for a couple of years. I am still actually learning what the full breadth of the repertoire is. I'm not quite sure like how many years it's actually going to take. For those of you who've moved around in parishes, you know that like often the previous music director does not leave you the list of like the songs that the parish knows, right? You kind of have to discern that.
Yeah.
And it's important too not to take for granted just because the last parish that you were at knew XYZ songs that this parish, you know, I ran into that my first year here where we were going to do Rain Down. And I said to the choir, oh, we don't need to practice that one. They're like, we've never seen this before. And I thought, oh my gosh, Rain Down? Really? So, you know, we don't take that for granted. And so then once I'm comfortable knowing that, and then looking at the repertoire of what's known, then making really careful discernments about like, all right, so what are we missing now? What texts, which, if we're talking about communion songs, what aspects of the Eucharist are maybe missing in the general repertoire that we know, and how can I supplement that? How can I make that more whole? And so, yeah, there have been I've noticed that this parish in particular knows a lot of the communion songs that are like the "We Are the Body of Christ" songs. Like I'm sure you can think of many of those. And not as many of like the Eucharist as summit, or like the like thinking of the various aspects of just, you know, transubstantiation or like the body and blood of Christ. Like those are not as prevalent in the repertoire here. So I've been thinking about how to introduce those. And the great thing about communion songs is that they like a communion song will fit at any mass, regardless of like what the readings are, because it speaks to the ritual act. Bonus points when it fits to the gospel really nicely, but you know, it'll work. And so when we introduce it, we'll do it 3 or 4 weeks in a row. In addition to if I think we need to do any like particular teaching of the song beforehand. But I have found that that's usually enough to make people start to feel comfortable, so that when we come back to it, maybe in a couple months, it feels familiar.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and thanks for, I appreciate in your response, not only, you know, getting into some of the practical, which of course we want to talk about, but also really saying that part of a consideration around how to introduce new music in a congregation really is based upon planning. I like the you know, that encouragement to really know congregation's repertoire, to see what's missing, to see what's possible, to get a sense of maybe what's already in their ears, on their hearts, on their minds, but to not be surprised, because I think maybe many of us, if we've moved from one place of ministry to another, might have similar experiences, or different schools, been in places where you assume, of course, they're going to know that particular piece and blow past it and are caught by surprise, you know, definitely. Scott, in your community, and I know that you've been at the church for a while, and they have that core repertoire of hymnal 1982. As you think about, you know, introducing new pieces in the planning considerations, right? So as you're planning, what are some of the things that you evaluate or you consider or you look for in the planning when you're selecting a new piece you're going to introduce to your congregation?
Yeah, well, one of the things that Zach said I like is, we have a big responsibility, and I'd be curious to hear Zach, what's our relationship with the clergy and so forth, because we have a big responsibility, and I think a lot of times, even myself, I gravitate toward making decisions based on the music, and uh, but that's only half of it, because the clergy are very interested in in the theological content, and so I, we have a big responsibility to make sure that our congregations are expressing, you know, expressing theological ideas, uh, the correct range of ideas, and what are they missing? And I really think that's important. And so when I'm evaluating a new piece, uh, that's one of the things. And I was recently at the Hymn Society last year, and in the summer, and it was very interesting because the great thing about conventions like that is that you get to experience a lot of music. I sang so many different pieces of music, and it's just interesting to be in that situation because you start to see things that work and what things that don't work. And there were a lot of the music that we sang there was new, newly composed or whatever. And I saw that, boy, I would never do this piece. The vocal range is too high, or the tessitura, it's too high. Uh, or there's a piece that was written in, and it's really not capturing the essence of the Eucharist correctly, or it's a little bit odd. And then there are other pieces where it's like this. I can just picture people in my congregation singing it and loving it. And so, I think there's quite a few things that make a piece work or doesn't work. And I think the range is a big one, especially for newly composed works. Now, fortunately, a lot of our editors at GIA, OCP, etc., we try to account for that so that when a piece gets published, there's already been quite a bit of discernment regarding the range of a piece, the tessitura. But I think those are important considerations, and I just want to reiterate, we have a big responsibility to make sure that we're covering our bases theologically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a point well made. And Zach, I know, one of the foundational pieces that we're talking about here, right? And you mentioned it in terms of, text and discerning what's missing in the repertoire, what needs to be added, what needs to be shored up, changed, etc. Even one layer back, there's another foundational sort of like philosophy or belief or something here, and that is that your congregation can and should and will and is capable of learning and singing new music, right? And sometimes I think for many of us, especially if we've had a hard time introducing new pieces or have experiences where it didn't go particularly well, that can be really discouraging. And we might be hesitant to try it again because of other experiences. As you think about your congregation at Guardian Angels, how do you embody that sort of philosophical approach, that belief that your congregation can sing? Is that a hard thing to maintain? Is it hard to maintain that belief?
When I came to Guardian Angels, one thing I heard from the assembly and from the choir all the time was how much this parish loves to sing. And I don't think that it's necessarily unique to this parish. We were talking before we opened the room here. I really believe that groups of people, human people, are predisposed to want to sing together. They're happy to do it when they feel like they're in the environment where it's invited, where it feels safe to do so, right? And for a variety of reasons, I think somehow in churches we've put up some roadblocks where people don't feel the same way.
Hmm.
Like, why is it so easy to gather the staff in your office together to sing happy birthday for, Janice down the hall? No one moans and groans about that. Everyone full-throated will sing that. Um, so what are the roadblocks then when we get into church? I think I've been thinking a lot about that the last just couple years, in terms of just congregational singing, but also in terms of introducing new music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, really what I hear you say in that is that, the practical steps of introducing a new piece are obviously important, and the roadmap and the timing and everything you do, but that context of, we have a congregational singing culture where it's safe to sing and comfortable to sing and encouraged to sing, like, that's the thing that, if we can develop that, introducing new music into the context goes over very differently.
Yeah.
How do you create a safe space to sing, right, congregationally? Like, I mean, I know that's a big question. That's a whole different series of webinars, right? But I mean, like, just at the foundational level for either you, Scott, or you, Zack, like, what are some of these consistent steps or things we can do to create that space to then, receive new music as we teach it?
Yeah, for me, there's a couple practical things, and then there's a philosophical. The philosophical thing is that I try to do, because I firmly believe that no one's going to be more excited about the music we sing than me.
Hmm.
And so, not that I have to be, cheerleader. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying no one's going to be. It's just like a leader, and any kind of leader. No one's more excited or, about the mission of whatever the organization is than the leader, typically. And so I think the word is culture. We have to develop a culture where we are having fun together singing. And this is incredible that we get to do this. I mean, I'm speaking with flowery language, but there has to be this kind of feeling behind the culture. Now, practically, a couple things that we do to reinforce that, like, I will put a paragraph we have a monthly newsletter. I'll put a paragraph in there about new music that we're going to be singing. Not a lot, but just so it gets people thinking in terms of, oh, we're in a parish that has new music coming in, and and explaining a little bit about the music, giving people a little bit of a taste. It's kind of fun. Zack, you have the same experience as I do, working with so many different composers in our jobs, and then we get to take their music, and people love it when you know the composer, or you can explain a little bit about the origin of the piece. So these are a couple of things that I think help develop a culture of, we are having fun singing.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I
that
think
also
too,
creates the expectation that, as a member of the congregation, new music is a thing that we encounter from time to time. It's not just a surprise or something that happens because we changed the text or whatever, but that this is a thing that we do, right? I mean,
A
it
regular,
reinforces that.
yeah,
So,
right.
yeah.
yeah, I think there are a lot of practical things that can help facilitate this too. And I think it's also like knowing your assembly well enough to know what their endurance is for new music. How many new things can they handle over the course of a month, over the course of a year? I know when we introduced our new mass setting, I made sure that every other hymn that we sang was something that they all knew. There was that they just were very familiar with, so that, so as to not test the endurance of that. And I
Right.
think too, the way that we speak to our assemblies, like I've seen some music directors when I've been in like visiting parishes where they'll teach the assembly a song, but they'll teach it to them like the assembly is the choir or like the cantors, using, probably not even realizing it, but using musical terms that these people don't know what they mean. Talking about intervals, talking about like, that's not how the unmusically inclined are engaging with music. And I think that can be intimidating and off-putting. I'm very careful about the language I use when I introduce stuff to assemblies. My language is more about just, we want you to participate in this song. I go so far as to say, even if you want to just speak the words along with us and not sing, that would be welcome. I'm not looking to create, a great choral society out of you, but I do want to create the space where you all feel comfortable creating this sound together, responding together, because that's part of our call to how we fully, actively, and consciously participate in the liturgy.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that that suggestion of, providing it's scaffolding, right? Providing that opportunity, for those who are gung-ho about learning the new piece, those who are hearing it, just to be able to get into the text. I mean, no matter who I am or where I am in your community, or how I feel like I do or don't fit into that culture of singing, or how comfortable I am or I'm not, you're focusing me to slot myself into some part of the internalization process, in a way that's really helpful. I think that's really great. A couple of things are coming through in the chat, and I want to make sure that we can acknowledge them both, so they're in the recording, but also work them into the conversation. So Cynthia and Suze both have talked about how different opportunities to introduce, at least melodically, if nothing else, a new piece into their congregation. Cynthia mentions at times maybe using that new piece in place of a prelude, so people can hear it, or introducing a new mass setting one part at a time, sometimes teaching it, repeating it multiple times, etc. Suze mentions, even maybe using a piece also as a recessional, putting that melody into the places where you can, so people hear it. In terms of, again, getting down to, introducing that new communion song, Zack, having done the discernment, having tried to create the fertile ground for new music within your singing culture, how did you go about actually introducing the new musical piece to the congregation? Was it a prelude? Did you teach it to them? What were those steps?
Specifically, the last couple communion songs, I thought were fairly simple, and so there wasn't any intentional, like, separate rehearsal of it. I try to not do that unless I have to, only because I kind of think now, as I'm like trying to like think through, I guess, this like philosophy or like theory, that if you set it up as rehearsal, it makes people feel like I'm treating them as though they're supposed to be a choir. So what has really worked for me, especially like with communion songs, is to do it like 4 weeks in a row, and then to not maybe let a couple weeks go by and do it again, to just see if it's there. So that's been part of it. And then if it's just not catching on, that might be that this song isn't working. First of all, you got to discern that. And then or I'll do like a separate rehearsal and just say, hey, it seems like we could use a few hearings of this. Let's try that. So with those, that has mostly been the process. I think for whatever reason, I like music directors want to do different things every week. I don't know if we get sick of it or what, but like I know when I've suggested this to people before, they're like, you do the same communion song 4 times in a row? Like, yeah. And then we have a new communion song that we can mix into the. So I think maybe getting over that a little bit. It also just creates so much space for your choir too, because then you're not having to rehearse a new communion song every week. You can, especially as Christmas is coming up, yeah, like just creating that rehearsal space too, really helpful.
I love that. And that's something we have to remember at our work at OCP and GIA and so forth. Like, we get sick of music way faster than your typical person. So and this comes, it also comes into play. One thing, I was going to mention another practical thing that we've started doing is we have a on our website, occasionally we'll put in the weekly email that goes out to the parish. I'll put in a YouTube link or multiple YouTube links for upcoming hymns. And I'm surprised by the number of people that appreciate that. It may not be everyone, but even if it's 1/10 of the congregation who is appreciative, it really helps for them to get the music in their ears.
Yeah.
You know, what you were talking about, Zach, if a piece doesn't work well, whatever. And one thing I'm sure we've all experienced is that when someone comes up afterwards and gives us their opinion, and I've learned how do you deal with that? Because that's a tricky situation. So many things involved. There's pastoral perspective, there's the musical perspective, there's there's so many. So you really, anyway, I has had this last week someone come up to me after church said, no one was singing that. It was a new piece we started in. No one was singing it, and I said, thank you for your feet. You don't want to get into an argument, right? So thank you for your feedback, but I've learned that you have to take those things with a grain of salt, because just because one parishioner comes up to you and gives you negative feedback doesn't mean it was a disaster.
Yeah.
So incorporating feedback and knowing what to do with it,
Right.
that is a tricky thing as well.
And I want to stick with or come back to the question of how do you know if a piece you introduced isn't working, right? Just so we can be attentive to it, but not sensitive in the wrong ways to it. Before that, Lori mentions in the chat, and this is something that I found in my parishes also some success with. She writes that we put together a seasonal Spotify list for cleaning. I'm assuming like to listen to while you're cleaning. It's all of the music on the schedule for a particular season. We started to do this in my parishes around around the time of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic as a way to help kids in the school or different musicians learn new music across parishes. And because I was putting it together for musicians, we just put it together as like the little Spotify code or link in our bulletin, and we get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of listens to those Spotify playlists every week because people like something to listen to in the car or out for a walk, or becomes their soundtrack. And then the happy accident is then some of that music is familiar. So some of this is also a way of, maybe using, getting more utility out of some of the ways that you're even putting some of those recordings in front of your musicians. So
that's like a relatively
go ahead.
That's like a relatively new thing that we're able to do. Like for so long, the music that are in our hymnals, unless you had like the CD and or if you were like going to the conventions to buy them, you didn't like, for people especially attending like Catholic parishes, were not really listening to it, which was so different than our Protestant brothers and sisters, right? Where they would show up to their service and then often the songs they were singing at the service are the songs that you actually heard on Christian radio. And that's been happening for a long time over on that side of the fence, and why they're able to just why they know all the songs. They're listening to them in the car all the time.
Right. And to that point too, when you think about, again, what are members of your congregation looking for? And this isn't going to be everybody, right? But I know Catholic radio is a strong force around the country, and there is precious little music in many Catholic radio stations, and certainly not necessarily music that we're going to encounter, at Mass or at other liturgical forms of worship. And so sometimes, again, I it's anecdotal, right? But I heard lots of comments from people saying this is great because it's something I can listen to that connects in a way that I've been looking for. So it's there, and who knows? To your point, Zach, you're right. It's a relatively new phenomenon, and if not new to us, to you, what you mentioned, Scott, so many things that we get sick of or we assume everyone knows about. I am still amazed in my work, in Catholic publishing, the number of music directors who don't know that you can find all of, or most at least, of GIA's music or OCP's music on Spotify and on YouTube, let alone our members of our congregation, right? So introducing this might be a new thing. Suze asked the question, to circle back to what you were mentioning before, Zach. It's important to discern, give a piece time, do your darndest, introduce it well, but at some point discern, is it that new piece you introduced working or not? So how do you do that? I mean, I'm sure it's a lot of by observation and by feel, but what are you looking for after a certain length of time or other comments? what are your data points for evaluation?
But at least in my parish, and in my experience, when we've introduced new things, like I I can hear, especially like where I'm seated, I can hear increased involvement over the weeks, as people become familiar with it. And I also know what the sound of my parish is when
Yeah.
they sing "Here I Am, Lord," or "I am the bread of life," or "On Eagle's Wings." I know
Mm, yeah.
what the familiar sound is and what I'm listening for. People, we have a great resource now. So many parishes are live streaming their masses, and hopefully you're putting a mic on the assembly. If you're not, please start doing that. You should be doing that.
Mm.
And you could listen back and you can hear them. So that's the baseline. That's the sound I'm going for. I want them to sound like they sound like when they're singing "Here I Am, Lord." And if I'm not hearing a trajectory toward that after teaching, after, doing it consistently, and several times. I mean, obviously, "Here I Am, Lord" has gotten to the place because people have sung it hundreds of times in their life, if not maybe thousands, depending on how many funerals you do. Uh,
Right.
uh, if there at least isn't trajectory, that's when I start to think, okay,
Yeah.
this is not anything to do with how we're teaching it. Maybe, and like, just some songs fall flat places. You think they're going to be great. Maybe it's, there have been times when, like, it's been songs that I love that it's like, oh man, it's just not I don't hear that incline of participation. You just, at that point, that's when I let it go.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
and I want to spike the ball on a couple of things that you mentioned, because I think they're so important. And one of them is, you mentioned from where you are, the space you occupy in your role, you have a good sense of the sound of what's happening in your congregation. And that's great. And not everybody has that. Or even if you do have that, it might not be consistent. So it's important to be able to, like you said, listen to the live stream, or find times where, either during that piece, during the communion procession, maybe at a liturgy, or having somebody else play a liturgy so you can just be present in the actual church space to hear, is really important. And it all goes back to, your own research, right, and your own awareness of your congregation. I love the suggestion of having that baseline. How do you know if a piece is working? Well, what is the baseline? And singing that known familiar piece, and not expecting them to get there and sing that new communion piece like they sang, "I am the bread of life" or something, but to have that consistent trajectory, I think, is really helpful. And the permission to say that piece didn't work and we move
Yeah.
on, I think, is also helpful. So giving yourself that permission, but also giving it the time and putting yourself in the place where you need to be able to listen, I think, is really, really important.
I think
Do you have
that's a
anything to
great.
add to that, Scott?
Yeah, just a couple things. One, yeah, I will be, the way our church is configured is that the choir is back behind the altar.
Mm,
And so I'm back there a lot, and we have microphones and kind of helps, but so it's hard for me to hear
mhm.
congregation. So yes, I will go back during certain hymns. I'll go out the side, no one sees me, come out and I'll go and I'll stand in the back and I'll just listen really to see how well it works. That's one thing. The other thing is that, and I don't know if it's you have to be careful with certain. Here's the point: you don't want drama. You don't want congregational drama. So I have one parishioner who, if I don't handle it correctly, all of a
Mm,
sudden the new song and its success or not, usually it's because they don't think it's a good song. All of a sudden this becomes conversation fodder, and people are saying, "Yeah, I didn't like it." So, again, part of creating a culture of uh, positivity and exploration and trying new things, and because you don't want uh, certain parishioners to create negative drama in the church. So, it's something that an overall approach can help with.
yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to clarify real quick. When I suggested to mic the congregation, that was for the live stream. Like, you don't want to put that sound into your main speakers.
Right.
just for the live stream.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, and again, this is another conversation, another webinar, or whatever. But as I don't consume live stream worship, right? For a variety of reasons. I didn't necessarily take to it like maybe some have, and thankfully, we're able to be in the physical space within our congregation each weekend. But the times watching live stream where you can't hear the congregation sing, or you can't hear the congregation's spoken responses, means that live stream worship is it even feels even more disconnected. If it's, the Lord be with you, and it's just silent.
Well,
Lift up
it's
your hearts, I mean, but putting it in not only for good live stream, but also for that overall good effect.
Well, at St. John's, it's interesting. We have one of these huge things on the side, one of these big screens. We share the church with the school, and we actually have Zoom, and you can see everybody's faces up on this huge screen on the side, and you can see them singing along. You can't hear them, but you can see them singing along, and that is really interesting because it creates a bit of a unity, some unity within the parish, because you're seeing them do it.
I have to, I mean, I think like there's a part of me that finds that very beautiful, and another part of me that is really stressed out.
It's like Hollywood Squares.
By thinking about it. So let's talk about a specific application. I know we mentioned, how you introduced those communion songs, Zach, and especially at that point in the liturgy and in that ritual moment, right? That week over week repetition makes a lot of sense. And there are all kinds of things you can do, of course. Maybe you're inviting the congregation to just sing on the refrain to start, and then you can add in verses. So you can scaffold that. That makes sense. Let's talk about two other just forms or times of the liturgy application. What about something that, is a song or a hymn that's going to be used at, for a procession or at prep of gifts? And then what about something like mass acclamations? So how, and maybe again, Zach, because you kicked us off on this, I'll start with you. Like, do you take any different approach, or do you have any other intermediary steps thinking about those pieces at that time of the liturgy, as opposed to something that, again, you can approach like you described for communion hymns?
Well, I mean, just very practically, prep of gifts can function very much the same as communion songs. Like you can do the same one over the course of many weeks, or like if you maybe like they can kind of work in both places. So like maybe you introduce it like 4 times in communion, and then you start using it in other places, like prep of gifts. Gathering song, because it has such a it has such a specific ritual tone. That's hard to do because that one probably does need prior to Mass teaching before you use it. And maybe not just prior to the Mass that you're going to use it at, introducing it a couple weeks in advance, so that people are ready for it when they need to. And same for recessional songs. I think gathering songs too. I mean, we have also done that, where we'll use the same one over the course of a few weeks. I think mostly just, I wish I had better, more like sophisticated sounding advice, but just like the repetition of doing it many weeks. For whatever reason, in these circles, it sounds revolutionary, because I know people don't really do that often. They do different songs every week.
Well, no, I think that is a sophisticated response, in the sense that, I mean, it's a familiar response or familiar advice in this conversation. But when you pan out again to consider, so what are the implications of that? The implications of that are, do introduce new music. Believe your congregation can and will and needs to sing something new, but don't overwhelm, and don't pick based upon your own impulse. And you have to strategize, right? You have to, if you're going to pick something new and you have to repeat it, or it's best to repeat it 5 times, whatever it is, well, then it takes up that much space in your planning. And don't add in six other new communion pieces within that same season or whatever it is. And I
Right.
know, Scott, you were talking earlier before we opened the room about that sense of longer term planning or looking at the year or looking ahead. So when you're choosing new music, you have a sense of managing how many new pieces you're introducing. How do you look ahead or look at the timeline and balance the time needed, the time you have with the new pieces that you select?
Yes. Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I wanted to mention one other thing that going back to, um, we get sick of music way faster than the congregation. So I get nervous when I think about repeating a piece too many times. My
Mm,
musician, like the musician part of me, like people are going to get bored. But if you put yourself in their shoes, you come to church, you're sitting there and you sing the song, and then you come next time you sing it again. It's really not that big of a deal. But to me, a lot of times as a musician, I'm like, oh, we can't keep doing this over and over. People are going to get bored. But that's not necessarily the case. So I, I really think that every church is different. Every music director is different. The priests, the clergy, everything's different from church to church. So it really depends. And I think having a yearly planning about this and involving decision makers in the church in it as to some extent, uh, you know, even if it's just looking forward to this next year. I wanted to alert you to some of the new music that we're interested in incorporating this next year. Here's a list. Here are YouTube links. Kind of getting buy-in from
mm,
key people beforehand, so that you avoid the situation of clergy not knowing what's going on and reacting. You know, we want to get buy-in on a long-term basis as much as possible, I think, with new music.
yeah.
I realize what maybe the more sophisticated angle is to what I was saying, and that is when you introduce new music to a congregation, I think part of the language and part of the message should be is that we are introducing this to be a part of our standard repertoire.
Mm,
This is not going to be a one-hit wonder. And I think a lot of times when
Mm.
people introduce new songs for various things or whatever, it's often a one-off. And so why ask the assembly to invest in learning a new song if we're not going to get any mileage out of it, right? Like I worked at a parish once where I was trying to discern what the repertoire was, and luckily they had a large database of the slide projections of like songs that were in the library. So I made the conclusion that, oh, these must be songs that the assembly knows. No, it was not true. There were a lot of songs that the
Yeah.
choir's like, yeah, I think we did that once, like
Right.
20 years ago. And a lot like, so I think if we're going to take the leap of asking our assemblies to commit to learning new music with us, we should have a long-term plan of how we feel that this music is going to fit into the standard repertoire of the church. And when we commission a song for a special dedication of something, or we something is so specific to that event, how can we also still get mileage out of that,
mhm,
and not just let these songs come and go.
right,
That's how we get buy-in.
right. No, I think that I think
And
that's
I,
I think that's well
I
said.
think
Yeah.
there's on the other end of new music introduction is a chance for some good work, and that is reflecting back to them. Well, first of all, I want to jump on that. That is such a great part of the overall philosophy. Make sure that when you're introducing something, that it's because you're trying to expand the
Yeah.
church's repertoire,
Yeah.
not because you think it's a good piece and maybe people like it, but because we're trying to expand the
Right.
repertoire. That's really, I think, important. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that's a great response. I think that's exactly right.
I was
And
gonna say,
oh yeah, go please.
reflecting back, like even if it's just a piece of paper on the bulletin board or
Mm,
something in the newsletter, something like, great job, everybody, meaning the congregation. Look at the new songs we've learned over the
mhm,
last 6 months. Just something where people can go, oh, I guess we're pretty cool.
Well, and again, it demonstrates the capacity that we can do this, right? We can sing this, and it is fun, and it adds to that overall culture. No, I think what you mentioned, Zach, is so important. And again, to return to one of the first things that we talked about as a step to considering new music, really knowing your parish's repertoire, I think is helpful just to reiterate it again, in the if we're looking to introduce a piece or find a new piece to fill a particular gap, is there a piece or a hymn tune that you can match with a different text or something that already exists in the repertoire that maybe hasn't been included in the last couple of years? As you mentioned, we're not always great at leaving, lists or plans for the next person, or even remembering the ones that we had for ourselves. There are times that I know in my parish, and we've had other conversations in other settings about this, the quote unquote evaporation of hymn tunes in parish repertoire, where we're using fewer and fewer hymn tunes nationally than maybe we did before, and the need to introduce some. I was able to go back to say what were the the missals or the hymnals or the things my parish used maybe 5-10 years ago, and what were some of the tunes they would know that we haven't used yet, and those were the ones that we incorporated or we matched text to, because they might be new to some members, but for others, they're familiar. They just haven't sung them in a while, right? So there's an intermediary, brand spanking new, ink is still wet, and stuff that we know that we can also go to consider. I want to get to a question that Herv mentioned before about hymnals and new music and notes and staff and things, but I do want to circle back, and maybe there's nothing more to add than what's been said, but what about introducing new mass acclamations? Or maybe also how introducing new mass acclamations, that task maybe filters into choosing a new mass to introduce. How do you think about choosing that new mass and introducing a new mass to your congregation? I think, Zach, you mentioned you just introduced one, right? Or recently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think perhaps the first step is discerning, do you need a new mass setting?
Yeah.
Like, just take a look at all the ones that you know. And if you're just someone who's sitting in the pews at this time, is the new mass setting just because the choir and the music director are sick of the ones that we've been doing?
Yeah.
And is that a good reason for changing it up? I know the publishers probably don't like that answer. But second, so I felt that what our assembly was missing was just a more we had really we knew a lot of the big mass settings that you would use for Christmas season, Easter season, that at the point then when we used them during those seasons, it didn't feel like an elevation. Yeah. So I'm trying to be careful about how I'm not saying that we needed a more mundane mass setting, so that by contrast the other ones seemed bigger, but just one that was more, I guess, ordinary time-ish in tone.
Yeah.
So that's how I came to that discernment that we needed one in the repertoire. And I think with introducing new mass acclamations, it's a long project and you have to commit to it. And the assembly, the choir, and the staff has to be on board, because I had to say to our staff, hey, I need several weekends in a row to roll this out where we're not going to have also speakers about the mission trip and second collection speakers about this, and to clear the deck, to say, and I think that sends a signal to the assembly, we need everyone to be able to feel comfortable participating in this, and it's this much of a priority, right? Because the Eucharistic acclamations are our way of entering into that part of the liturgy. So I think full commitment to it, discerning what it is you need, discerning if you do need it, and then finding a part of the liturgical year where you're able to do it a lot. I mean, the difficult thing about Advent mass settings, for instance, you don't have a lot of time to to
Right.
do it. And it's weird to kind of like sing them in advance of Advent. You know, it just feels it's hard. I'm not saying don't ever do it, but like if you haven't introduced a new mass setting in a while at your parish, perhaps Advent is, or Lent even, is not the time to do it.
Or ordinary time one,
Right.
if you only have, in some years 5 Sundays or whatever, makes sense.
No,
And I think,
summer is the best time.
just a real practical thing too. I know in my parish we've appreciated being able to sing, a through composed Gloria, which is great. But when we introduce a new mass setting, we often sing the refrain verse format because if nothing else, people are internalizing that refrain sooner, right? Before we move right into the. So I mean, there's a variety of other things that that work that way. Given the amount of time, I want to go back to ask a question about the role of hymnals in introducing new music and projection screens. Or have asked, does the congregation need the staff and notes? Are we assuming they can read them? So I want to get there, but before we move off of this topic, another question about, what do you do in shorter seasons like Advent or Lent or Holy Week, especially in seasons or in your community if you're not using a lot of instrumentation to teach new music? This, goes back to, I think, some of the conversation around a longer range plan and what's missing from your repertoire. There are pieces that might happen to speak to the readings of Lent that can obviously be used outside of that particular season that, we used or we introduced during Holy Week, or wanted to use during Holy Week, several new pieces because we had some gaps in our repertoire that also fit with readings or other things happening months before that during other times of the liturgical year. And that's when we learned them. So when we came back to then using that piece during a mass during Holy Week or another season, it wasn't the time that we were introducing it. So if there's that doesn't work necessarily with all of the seasons, right? But if there's a particular piece that makes sense during the Sunday in Lent, is there another time earlier that it can be utilized so that you're not teaching it during Lent? But let's go to that question of the actual format. And I'm thinking of an extreme case. If I'm in a church where it's just projection and all we're doing are lyrics, or do we need to have the notes? Do we need to have the staff? Do we need to have the printed worship aid as a tool for the congregation? Do you recommend that? Are there ways around that? What are your thoughts from a musical formation?
One of the things that that we're talking about at OCP and so forth is the state of music education in the country, and this idea that over the last 20 years, the kind of musical education that you get in public school or in school, 20 years ago is different than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's safe to say that there's less instruction. And so I think that I always try to include the notation, whether it's in the bulletin and we do put things up on the screen for our streamers, because I really feel like it's almost the church is one of the areas where people are continuing to encounter notation, music, and it's an opportunity for them to learn. So I lean toward including the notation, but if it's a super simple piece that everyone knows and space is a consideration of the bulletin or whatever, sometimes having the words only, I think, is just fine.
Yeah. What about you, Zach? What's your instinct tell you?
I strongly encourage people to always include the notation, not because I think anyone knows how to read music. I don't think hardly anyone knows how to read music anymore. But because even just like the way our system of notation works, it's kind of like a graphic like even if you don't know exactly what it means, graphically, it shows you shape and contour. The spacing will kind of indicate to you when like notes are held or when notes are going to be faster. I think people without realizing it just are able to follow along with the organization of it that way.
Sure.
And I've just found like when I put the notes, even with a song that everyone knows, when I put the notes versus when I don't, to me it's an audible difference.
Mm. Well,
And that might just be my parish. Who
Yeah.
knows?
to tag on to that, I mean, if you think about, okay, you got a congregation. How many of people in the congregation read music? Well, who knows? A certain percentage, right? Well, if there's not notes, who's going to lead the singing?
Mhm.
Obviously, the cantors, the choir, but also the people in the congregation who are more accomplished singers. And they are going to be much more apt to sing if they see notes. If they're musicians in the
Mm.
congregation, maybe they sang in choir in high school and they can read notes, but they don't, you know. So that's another reason to have notation because it helps the leaders lead.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the other points that was brought up before, and I think Zach, especially as you were mentioning introducing new mass settings, right, we also want to remind folks that never waste an opportunity for liturgical catechesis. Right here, we're learning a new mass setting. These are the mass acclamations. This is what they are. This is why we do them. This is why they're important, etc. I think to a lesser extent, but parallel example, you don't want to turn these things into a music lesson necessarily. But I do think that there are ways where we can take advantage of these opportunities in order to, even if it's just the contours or relative pitch or relative intervals or whatever, we can move the needle a little on our overall music literacy because we include it, so I think there is a way that we can contribute to the overall state of things that way. I'm going to ask you, Scott, and you, Zach, to give us sort of like final thought, final encouragement, whether it's like putting a bow on it or it's the one thing you forgot to say or the thing you want everyone to remember. So I'm going to give you a chance to think about what you want that to be. For all of you who have joined us live, those of you who are watching this after the fact, thank you for spending this last hour with us. I know we just scratched the surface. Hopefully we gave you some bigger philosophical considerations as well as some direction for practical considerations. I've been capturing all of these and the things from the chat and the things from the Q&A. We'll put them together as a growing list, a hive mind list of best practices for introducing new music. And we'll share that out with all of you, and it'll be posted on our website along with some other resources that you might find helpful as you introduce new music. Scott, I'm going to come to you first. Final thought or final encouragement for everyone before we sign off.
I guess my thought is that it can be helpful to look at the concept of introducing new music. Make sure that you treat it as a concept that needs to be addressed, considered, and implemented. I've fallen into this myself, where I'm just like, okay, well, I think we're going to add this piece. Well,
yeah,
approach it like you might approach planning for the whole year. Approach it with some philosophical underpinnings, and get buy-in from key people.
Yeah.
I guess that would be my tying it in a bow.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. What about you, Zach?
I think probably we would all benefit if we all were consistently looking at our repertoire as a whole and analyzing the range of theology that we are exposing our assembly to through those songs, and then discerning where are the holes. I don't think introducing new songs should just be based because like we heard a great new song at the NPM or at the GIA or the OCP showcase. Oh, that was great. It has to be deeper than that. And so theologically and textually, whether the assembly needs to be singing these words, even if like it's the most beautiful melody you've ever heard, I think that should be the guiding light as far as introducing new music. And then I think there's so much that can be gained from looking at your repertoire as a whole. Like what voices are maybe not being represented in our repertoire? Do we have music written by Black Americans, by women, by people speaking other languages than us from different time periods? Do we have things that stretch all the way back to the beginnings of the treasury of the repertoire? Do we have stuff, or are we firmly situated in the music of the 80s and the 90s? and music that's being composed today. All of these things I think can be considered and can be realized if we're engaging with the totality of our repertoire on a consistent basis.
Yeah. Well, again,
You know,
thanks to.
I just
Oh,
wanted
go
to say
ahead. Sorry,
one more
Scott. Go
little
ahead, please.
thing, and that was when we talk about the repertoire and buy-in. One of the most powerful things that happens at our church sometimes is when the sermon mentions some way, shape, or form something about the music. Like if a phrase in the music could be mentioned by the homilist, that's buy-in.
Mhm. We'll leave homiletics for a whole other series of webinars and conversations. Again, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Zach, for this time, for sharing your experience and your encouragement. Thanks to all of you for being here. Again, we see what you do. We appreciate what you do. And if there's any way that we can be helpful, please let us know. And we hope we'll see you on another OCP webinar sometime soon. Thanks, and God bless. Bye, everyone.